So our first speaker will be Nikolai, and I will give you a little bit more information on him. He is currently a UVic nursing student. He served in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. He was born and raised in the Soviet Union, and at the age of 18 drafted to military and was sent to Afghanistan from 87 to 89. He left Afghanistan with the last Soviet troops. Nikolai is alarmed by the similarities between the US-led occupation of Afghanistan and the past Soviet one. He is also concerned with the media's one-sided coverage of Afghanistan and the attitudes of Canadians towards the war. So here's to you, Nikolai.
My name is Nikolai. I'm a student here on campus, and as was said in the introduction, I served in Afghanistan between 1987 and 89. I was a Soviet draftee who was sent there, and the reason I started speaking out is because some of you might know my wife, who is Canadian. Her first cousin, Andrew Eichenboom, was killed in Afghanistan last August by a suicide bomber, and I just want to clarify, I'm not speaking for Andrew's family in any sense. I'm speaking as a Canadian who happened to have that experience, and Andrew's death and Andrew's funeral and what I observed around that was the last straw that basically encouraged me to speak about my thoughts and observations on that topic. So to make it very simple, I'll just speak to similarities I see between what's happening in Afghanistan now and back in the 80s, and I will let you make your own conclusions. So similarities I see, and pretty much I experienced all of them or observed them, most of them I experienced them myself. So claimed goals and justifications for war are pretty much identical. I mean, there is some different background to it and difference in details, but in principles they're the same. So claimed goals by Soviet Union was state security, building peaceful Afghanistan, women's rights, and I'm quoting, they're fighting for the right cause, for better future of Afghan people, helping Afghans, particularly with educating women and children. Another one is that at the time of making decision about deploying troops to Afghanistan, both in Soviet Union and in Canada, political leadership, not military one, in both countries appeared to have no or very little idea what they were actually getting into. There are similarities in declarations that were invited by Afghan government. Again, I'm quoting. Aggressive combat tactics by military ones in Afghanistan. Outcomes of policies in Afghanistan turned out to be very different or opposite of the claimed initial intentions. Whether intentions were genuine or not, again, I'll leave it up to you to decide. The state of civil war inside Afghanistan and very unreliable shift in loyalties and alliances between Afghan groups, political and ethnic groups, which are usually bought with foreign money of countries who are involved in Afghanistan, and usually very not long-lasting and unreliable. And Afghan politicians are using occupying forces to their advantage to address internal grievances. The last year's operation in Panjwai that was criticized by second-in-command British officer who quit, it was actually initiated by a governor of Helmand province. Afghans, both in the 80s and now, both progressive and fundamentalist, the opposite spectrum, are viewing foreign soldiers as aggressors and occupiers, while a narrow group of Afghan society is benefiting from occupation. And it's the case all throughout history. It doesn't matter which occupation you take, there is always a group that benefits from it, and majority suffers. Afghan government and army exists only because of support of foreign troops and foreign countries. The human side of war of all involved is pretty much the same. Soldiers, local population, resistance, the same story. Afghans, as back in the 80s now, are paying the price with their lives, and we don't see that picture anywhere. Attempts to reconcile fighting with so-called reconstruction and humanitarian aid, which is done by military. So, for example, I personally participated in similar attempts, and they failed. So it should be done by humanitarian organizations, obviously. Like back in the 80s now, Canada and NATO, they're not keeping account of Afghans killed by occupying forces, and attempts to discredit reports by international human rights organizations on a number of casualties. And you can see in the media, like you can open pretty much any newspaper and see it. Like back then now, Army officials are expressing enthusiastic support and their belief in the mission and in getting job done, again I'm quoting, while soldiers are not allowed to say to media what we really think. Actually, in that respect, ironically, USSR had easier rules, and it was better for soldiers to express what they were thinking. It just never got published because they never passed censorship. Here it's opposite situation. Soldiers are not allowed to speak to media, period. Another similarity, Canadians in NATO are fighting exactly the same Afghans that Soviet did in the 1980s. In many cases, they're literally the same people. If you look at neo-Taliban leadership now, like Mullah, Ammar, and others, they're exactly the same people who are fighting the Soviets, and they're fighting them for exactly the same reasons, which are not discussed. Basically, creation of Islamic State. It's not because they were anti-communist and pro-free market. It's because they were having their own agendas and their own beliefs, and they haven't changed. I don't see it change at all. Well, in 1980, Soviets called Afghan resistance, and you can project it on today. This is the words that were used, and I'm quoting: terrorists, extremists, insurgents, bandits, enemies of democratic Afghanistan, enemies of Afghan people, and scum. Today's Taliban was supported by West accidentally back in the 80s as a freedom fighters. It's a favorite term by President Reagan. And people who became later Al-Qaeda, Arabs who were coming to Afghanistan to fight jihad, Toronto Star called them ordinary people. And you can cross-check me. It's July 27, 1986, Sunday edition of Toronto Star. And accidentally they reprinted article from Washington Post. Another similarity, speeches of government officials at the funeral of soldiers killed in Afghanistan. And they were basically the same, paragraph after paragraph. He gave his life trying to save others. He didn't die in vain. He died for his country. He was trying to do good. He served his country, and on and on and on. And I attended a few funerals back in 1980s and endless memorials, more than I can remember, for fallen soldiers. And they're virtually identical, all these speeches. Government ban on media coverage of funerals of fallen soldiers was back in the USSR, the same here. Almost no reporting or information on wounded soldiers. I mean, we can see occasionally in media that somebody got hurt, but so you could see in Soviet Union. It wasn't reported on an everyday basis, but by the end of the war, information was out there. But
I'd do anything for you, dear. Anything for you, mean everything to me. I know that I'd go anywhere.